Very warm welcome and good afternoon from Vienna and good morning or good evening to hundreds of participants from around the world that have decided to join this webinar today. We are pleased to have you with us and thank you for your interest and time. My name is Nobuya Haraguchi. I'm Chief of the Research and Industrial Policy Advice Division of UNIDO and moderator of today's session. This is the second in a series of planned webinars to discuss the future of industrialization in a post-pandemic world. The title of today's session is Industrial Policy and the Road to Recovery. It is my pleasure and honor to present to you a truly stellar lineup of speakers who will produce unique insights on how we may build back better from the COVID-19 crisis. In this event, we aim to highlight the major challenges that the pandemic is posing to developing and emerging economies in their path towards industrialization. We will also discuss how governments and the international community can steer the recovery towards a more inclusive and sustainable outcome. We will do so by listening to short keynote addresses by some of the leading figures on the subject, both from international organizations and academia. Following the keynotes, we will open the floor to your questions. To this end, I'd like to take a moment to point you to the chat function of the platform, which you can find at the bottom of the screen, where we briefly summarize the introductions on how to engage with us during this session. We look forward to your active participation throughout the event. With no further delay, I now give the floor for a pre-recorded opening statement by UNIDO's Director General, Lee Yong.
Distinguished participants, friends, colleagues, I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar on industrial policy and the road to recovery. This is the second in a series of UNIDO virtual events to discuss the future of industrialization in the post-pandemic world. This is a topic of primary relevance for the international community and it will be the focus of the next flagship report of UNIDO, the Industrial Development Report. It is an honor to have with us an outstanding panel. I would like to thank Ms. Alicia Bassina, Professor Mariana Mazzucato, and Professor Justa Lin for their participation. The pandemic has highlighted the important role that industry plays. Beyond generating jobs and providing incomes, industry are needed to ensure the production and delivery of essential goods and services, including food, medical equipment, and pharmaceutical products. In this regard, strengthening the industrial sector is necessary as we recover from the pandemic. Industrial policies must be an essential element of the response and recovery plans of the government. Industrial policies have historically played a central role in economic development. The evidence is compelling. It was through active industrial policy that today's richest nations achieved structural change. This in turn helped them upgrading towards more resilient and competitive economies, providing the support for governments to develop their social and socio-economic sectors. There's no doubt that renewed industrial policies will have a significant place in shaping the road towards recovery from COVID-19 crisis. What will such a road look like? The answer largely depends on the extent to which the governments around the world are able to seize the opportunity to build back better and accelerate progress towards Agenda 2030. UNIDO is optimistic that this can happen. What we need is strong cooperation across multiple stakeholders, cooperation that involves the international community, governments, private sector, and the civil society. Complementing this with the right set of policy instruments and institutions, stimulus package offered the opportunity to transform and future-proof productive sectors, foster long-term socio-economic resilience. Examples include sustainable energy solutions, circular economy models, resource-efficient and cleaner production, interventions that will help generate inclusive green jobs that will mainstream vulnerable, including women and the youth. Recovery packages can also be designed to strategically promote the use of frontier technology of the fourth industrial revolution. Advances in robotic, artificial intelligence, additive manufacturing, and data analytics offer huge potential to accelerate inclusive innovation, building resilience, and increasing value-added content of production. UNIDO stands firm in its commitment to the implementation and achievement of the Sustainable Development Agenda. We look forward to our continuous collaboration with our network, including member states, counterpart organizations in the UN system, development financial institutions, the private sector, and academia to tap into the full spectrum of the resources and expertise necessary to leverage an inclusive and sustainable industrial recovery. I look forward to a fruitful and lively discussion with our distinguished panel. Thank you.
Thank you, the Director General, for this excellent introduction to the session's overarching theme. Indeed, as the DG has just highlighted, we are facing a global emergency, which has to be addressed with a renewed set of industrial policy responses. The DG flagged the importance of resuming the progress toward the Agenda 2030 in order to build back better. This does not depend solely on individual governments' responses, but requires close cooperation between the international community, the private sector, and the civil society. Now, I invite our first speaker to discuss the importance of collaboration across different stakeholders in shaping the road to recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. We had invited Alicia Barcena, Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, to participate to this panel. Unfortunately, unexpected circumstances prevented her from joining our discussion today. But we are very fortunate to have an internationally recognized expert of industrial policies participating on her behalf, Mr. Chimori, the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. With Joseph Stiglitz and Giovanni Dossi, he is also the co-chair of the Task Force on Industrial Policy of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University. Mr. Chimori, the COVID-19 pandemic is putting at risk the fulfillment of the SDGs. What should be the road to recovery, and how can the international community support this process? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will try to put the presentation. I don't know if you can see it. I will try to. It's great. You can see it. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Alicia couldn't stay here, Alicia Barcena. Sorry for that, but she has another meeting with New York. The SG called her for an important and urgent meeting. And she sent her regard to all of you, and for our friends from UNIDO, I'm very happy to work with UNIDO, start with this division and this group of research. That is a pleasure for us, and we hope that we continue to work together in the future. In the future, and this is. I want to make the first point is the following. Many times in Latin America, people have not speak about industrial policy. Industrial policy was a very bad word here in Latin America for a long time, 30 years or more than that. Today, after the pandemic crisis, many other issues became to be discussion, and many people accept, and economists mainstream accept, that the industrial policy and also don't have only an fiscal policy, restrictive fiscal policy, are two issues that is coming to stay in the debate for the politics and debate for economic policy. And particularly, what is for me is, I don't know, I don't understand, but it's very sad many times that many peoples in the region is speaking about industrial policy because it's arriving this virus, because the people understood that to have some industrial sector is important, to have a pharmaceutical sector is important, to produce an industry of health is important, to have some value change inside the country is important, and that is it's really that we have this situation after this crisis. But the only worry that we have on that is that we don't know if the people is continue to speak about industrial policy, because we are very worried that the mainstream idea that industrial policy is not necessary, that industrial policy is quite a little bad policy, but what could come back again. And our presentation, my presentation, that is going to be very brief, is going to be based with the recent document of ECLA, where we put clearly the idea what industrial policy have to do and what is important. And the main point that we believe that is really crucial is growth is everything about growth. It's the only variable we need to support, or we need more than growth. That is an important issue. Every type of work is equal, or we need different type of work. The quality of work of growth is important. And what we understand clearly, that growth is not enough, that there is another variable that are really important. And the first one is about redistribution. Why redistribution is important? Redistribution is important because we understand clearly, different what the mainstream that inequality is inefficient. When we have a precondition of economic system and many people and the society is very unequal, we don't have the precondition for growth, and we don't have the precondition for industrial development. Inequality or inequality is not the solution of the model. It's not the solution of the market. It's the precondition. We need a precondition. We need a more equal system, distribution, educational capabilities, skill, and access, for example, of the all informal sector. When you stay there in many developed countries and you want to understand what's happening in Latin America and many developing countries, you have to understand, for example, that the informal sector is more than a half of the whole economy. And when you're speaking about the informal sector, we are speaking about inequality, less capabilities, non-capabilities to create a skill, and so on. Okay, growth is important, but redistribution is important too. The other important issue is we need authentic competitiveness. It does mean industrial transformation or structural change. That is crucial. Growth only by growth is not necessary, because you continue to export, for example, primary commodities. You need to transform the structure and to have new sectors and new important changes. In face of this crisis, it's very difficult to understand which are the sectors we have to put our intention and our capabilities. But authentic competitiveness, industrial transformation, or if you want to call a structural change, are really important. Be careful about that. This is not an issue, because behalf of industrial transformation, there is the political economy. For example, if you want to introduce industrial policy, you have to speak with the incumbent sector. You have to speak with the incumbent industry. You have to speak, and you have to have a relation to understand how to transform the sector that is staying in the economy. That is not enough. We need to do that. Also, structural transformation, we need also to be more sustainable. That is crucial. Which type of industry? More sustainable. That is not only because Latin America have to do that, it's because the world economy and the multilateralists need to do that. Latin America is the region that has a small contribution to carbonization. It's not guilty of that. Latin America is the region where, for example, the contribution to carbon is very low, but other regions, Asia, Europe, or Latin and the United States, there is an enormous contribution on that. Latin America has to participate in that, but they need an important relationship with this economy that historically we have to do that and to say that has an enormous responsibility. I don't tell it for bad, but there is important dialogue of industrial transformation, decarbonization of the economy, and to understand, for example, that many developing countries has a very reduced contribution to carbonization. But there is another, the basis of the triangle. You have to see the basis. That has to do that with technical change. There is no way that in the basis there is no technical change. And this is clear our process. This is the way how ECLAC, we, Alicia Bárcena, presented recently, but this is the structure of our model. We need growth, redistribution, structural change, decarbonization, and technical change. Behind of this triangle, be careful about. It's not easy. And I want to put this sentence of Hirschman. I think this is more important because many times we think that we are expert on that, but we think that we discover everything about industrial policy. But people like Hirschman or Prebisch or Rosenthal-Rodan or Gerschenkrom, they understood many times this process, particularly understand what is about industrial policy. And what we want to put clearly on that, industrial policy, we can say, we want that sector, we want that industry, we want that, but the micro processes, the governance of the micro processes to transform the industry is not an easy one. There is disequilibrium, there is tension, there is disproportion, there is the political economy. When you have an incumbent and an industry, for example, that is an industry that has to be transformed by sustainable industry, it's not an easy task. There is a political economy process. Think about industrial policy, it's the same. Or many times you speak about the political economy and the tension and the micro tension that we have in industrial policy. We think, what are the issues that we have to discuss? We are putting clearly on the debate in Latin America. Structural interdependencies, that is important and matter. Direction of growth and changes matter also. Technical tension matter and it's important. And micro transformation is crucial one. If we think about the industrial policy, if we don't understand which is the micro transformation in terms of technological, new industry, incumbent industry, and so on, we don't have a process that is going to be very easy because all of this power tension is transforming in the election of the governments, in the election to maintain the status quo. And that is important to understand that if we want to put recipes on how to transform industry and transform the sector, micro tension is very important. We have an expert, we need an expert sector by sector and put clearly that debate. And it's important to have that there is the tension and we have an enormous opportunity, which is our worry, I want to put clearly in many developing countries. What we are coming out of this situation with a very difficult context because poverty is going to increase, inequality is going to increase, probably informal sector is going to increase. When the informal sector increase, also the productivity decrease, and we are going to have a system with a low employment and low productivity. In that case, it's not easy for this region to have an important policies to transform, to produce a shock, to lock out the situation. Latin America, many developing countries after this crisis can go to the process that we call an hysteresis situation. What is very difficult to transform if you don't have a shock, if you don't have something that is important. But to understand how we implement this shock, we need the microeconomics. We need to understand the political economy. We need to understand the debate on that. And we are putting that we think, because that is important, we have to come back on sectors. You remember when many people, you speak about sector, and people say, no, we don't have I speak about sector. Sector is not important. Political, industrial policy have to be horizontal. We think it's sector are important. We decide we decide, because we make an important and deeper study on that, that different sector we have to put. First sector that we have to put an enormous attention is energy transformation. We need to put, because energy transformation is not only related to the matrix, to the sustainability, but it's very important to reduce cost of firms. We need enormous policy in this region, transform more the interventional sector more on urban spaces. If you think Mexico City, Sao Paulo, and everything in this large city, also in Africa and other countries, there we have the subject of policy. Industrial policy has to be transformed. It's not only sector, it's not only firms. We need to relate urban spaces with sector and firm. That is an important. Digital revolution of sustainability. And here we have an enormous gap in Latin America. You have to think that only 60% of the people can be linked with the internet, and also young people and scholars don't have the access to this technology. It's an important issue. And we speak about the 5G, for example. We see we need to urbanize the city. We need 5G. 5G is an industry that requires rethink and everything about that, because we need important alliance between public and public sector. Healthcare and manufacturing industry, bioeconomy, circular economy, sustainable tourism. For priority, for the recovery, for us, these sectors are very important. Are not the only one, but are important. And also we need to rethink about extractive industry, because extractive industry stay in the region, are important, but have to be transformed. It's not easy. When you speak about extractive industry, for example, that is in the basis of the resources that we need by balance of payments, extractive industry is one of those representative sectors where the political economy, the tension, the rents, the distribution are put in there. My friends, industrial policy, I hope that is not only is becoming an important debate after this virus, because the virus put clear that industrial policy is needed, and not how it was for many years that the mainstream economists said in the region that is not necessary. Today is becoming necessary. It's coming to stay here, but we have to have a very realistic approach. The approach that to put clearly that is an issue of political economy, transformation, microeconomy, dialogue, public sector, and to choose new sector. Be careful about that. We have to reduce in the precondition the inequality. If we don't reduce the inequality as the basis for industrial policy, growth, and development, it's very difficult to achieve our objective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chimori, for your excellent perspective and emphasis on growth, redistribution, and decarbonization, which have to go hand in hand in order for countries to achieve inclusive and sustainable development. A quick note to our audience: if you'd like to ask a question to Mr. Chimori, please do so by using the Q&A function in the bottom part of your screen. Our next speaker was named as one of the 3 most important thinkers about innovation by the New Republic magazine, and as one of the 25 leaders shaping the future of capitalism by the Wired magazine. It is my pleasure to give the floor to Mariana Mazzucato, Professor of Economics of Innovation and Public Value at the University College London, where she is also the founding director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She has been awarded various international prizes, including the 2020 John von Neumann Award, the 2019 All European Academies Madame de Staël Prize for Cultural Values, and 2018 Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought. Professor Mazzucato is currently advisor to the OECD Secretary General and to various governments and policymakers on innovation-led, inclusive, and sustainable growth. Professor Mazzucato, we are pleased to have you with us today. The COVID-19 pandemic showed that some countries were better prepared than others to deal with the crisis because of the actions and policies they took in the past. What actions can governments take today to strengthen economic resilience and prepare for future crises? Professor Mazzucato, you now have the floor.
Great, thank you so much. It's such a fantastic question, and every day it becomes more urgent. I'm going to, present material that's very, very complementary to Mario, but I'm also going to provoke him a bit, as good friends must always do. Otherwise, we get too comfortable and lazy. So while I completely agree with you, Mario, that we need to pay attention to sectors, that's because you're comparing the old approach that just focused on horizontals versus verticals. And my critique is that the verticals, which you rightly say are important, should not necessarily be about sectors, but big problems from the digital divide to carbon neutrality to all sorts of issues around our health systems, which require all our sectors or most of our sectors to innovate, to invest, and especially to transform from within. And if we don't do that, it's very hard to get a proper public-private partnership. Any partnership, even a marriage between two people, can be abusive or can be beautiful. And I would argue we currently have very problematic partnerships, very problematic ecosystems, and we need to transform them through conditionality, conditions that are goal-focused. They're focused on the Sustainable Development Goals, but also much more precise on what I will call missions and moonshots. And what the COVID-19 crisis has done is thrown us a hell of a lot of moonshots that we better face very soon. If we don't govern it properly, it's a lost opportunity. Whether we're talking about the vaccine, it's not enough to race towards a vaccine. You need to actually govern the process of production and innovation in the public interest. That determines how you govern the intellectual property rights, the prices, the industrial capacity. But also, if you think of what we actually mean by well-being, or what we need for a Green Deal, it's not about just one sector, whether it's health or renewable energy. It's about lots of different sectors collaborating in a fundamentally new way. And they're not going to do it just by going to Davos and talking about stakeholder value and purpose. So that's where I'm going to begin, a bit of a thorn in the side to the Davos crowd as well. Basically what Mario was talking about was directionality. It is now the time, and we should have done it before. We should have done it with the financial crisis and we failed. It's now the time to stop talking about the direction of growth, the rate of growth, but to focus on the direction. And what does that actually mean? And of course, there's lots of talk about directions. The Sustainable Development Goals themselves are a direction. We're never going to achieve the 17 goals by just kind of sitting back and fixing market failures. These are really, really complex goals. They're wicked problems because they require technological, political, regulatory, behavioral change. But they're there. We signed up to them just 5 years ago. It was just 5 years ago. Sometimes people forget. We think they've been around forever. 5 years ago, countries signed up to them. What do we do with them? How do we put them at the center of industrial strategy, at the center of innovation policy, at the center of the everyday stuff like public procurement? Every government has a procurement budget, whether it's a developing country or an advanced developed country. And procurement is a huge portion actually of government investment and spend. How do you transform it to be SDG focused? All the talk about the Green Deal. What does it mean for the direction of a fiscal stimulus, for the direction of an industrial strategy? And this whole notion of building back better. What does that actually mean to make sure it's not just building back better, but as the title of my presentation said, building back much, 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 much better. And it's a great time, not only because we finally have these great goals, the SDGs, but we also have a lot of talk, not yet the walk, around stakeholder value. A lot of pronouncements and speeches and letters to the New York Times and the Davos big panels about purpose this, purpose that, stakeholder value. Okay, good, let's do it. Let's do it for real. And I must say that if we can't do it around the vaccine, if we can't do it around the digital divide with all these kids locked down increasingly, again, at home, and yet not having access to their human right of public education, if we can't collaborate with that purpose at the center, then who cares about the purpose talk? But also governments, come on. We're never going to have the transformation we require that Mario was talking about, that UNIDO talks about, that the whole UN talks about, that the OECD talks about, that the European Commission talks about, if we just bandage up the system every single time. Market failures, yes, it's an incredibly important approach in economic theory, but we don't get transitions by putting bandages on a failure. You can't wait for a market failure to then have a proactive approach. We actually need to move from a market fixing approach to public policy towards a much more proactive co-creation, co-shaping of markets to achieve the kind of growth we want. Inclusive, lower inequality, sustainable, greener, investment and innovation led, as opposed to private debt consumption led. What does that mean for proactive co-creation of a very different type of capitalism versus being trapped in this constant fixing mechanism? And, I wrote a book, sorry for a bit of self-promotion here, some years ago, saying, and if you don't like this, throw away your iPhone, please, because every single thing that makes it smart and not stupid was actually publicly financed, not by fixing markets, but by having a big problem in mind. So the internet itself was a solution to a problem. We wanted the satellites to communicate. GPS, which Google and Uber would have no market without GPS. That was a solution to a problem. Even the Google algorithm was, funded by the public sector. So instead of just saying, oh, look, the state is so important, what is the way that we can learn from history that public policy, when it's outcomes oriented, actually achieves these amazing spillovers? In fact, sorry, this previous slide was on all the general purpose technologies that we've had have very much been outcomes of this co-creation approach. What does it look like if we transform this problem-focused approach to policy towards actually tackling the SDGs? Because if we can't explain the GPTs, general purpose technologies, with the market failure approach, believe me, these problems, the SDGs, are much harder than even getting to the moon. We're not going to be able to explain how to get to the SDGs. And so, the moon landing, which we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of this year or last year, was not just a public project. It was not just NASA. There was lots of different private organizations that helped to invest, but they didn't just come in through some sort of random objective of commercialization or economic value, or help the SMEs come in to space research. It actually occurred because we really cared. It was this amazing, inspirational objective, getting to the moon and back again in one generation. And that required General Electric, Honeywell, General Motors, all to actually, invest and innovate. And that also occurred through actually redesigning the way that the state and the private sector work together. And it's fascinating. I'm actually writing a book about this that's coming out in January, of what it meant for the contracts, literally the contract, the compact between business and government, and procurement, how it was designed to fuel bottom-up innovation to achieve a public goal. And so today, I think the challenge is to, yes, of course, we should talk about sectors, but first you need to say, for what? What do we even care about? What are the big challenges we have? How do we transform the SDGs, the 17 goals, and the 169 targets beneath them into moonshots, missions that require many different sectors to invest and innovate, and conditionality, actually, so that the loans, the grants, the procurement is conditional on companies in the private sector to actually transform themselves to achieve that goal. And how do we design the tools that, the day-to-day tools like procurement, grants, loans, prize schemes to fuel the bottom-up innovation, to catalyze, to create additionality in the system? And these are just two examples I wrote about for a report I wrote for the European Commission, where the concept of missions and mission-oriented industrial strategy, mission-oriented innovation policy is now a legal instrument. They actually voted on it. It's not bad when you say that you should do something, they actually do it. So now there's a missions instrument, and this is how I explained it. You can't just get clean oceans by talking about that or climate change. You need to transform it into a concrete goal, get as many different sectors involved, and redesign those policy instruments to get there. But especially we need state capacity. With COVID, we've realized actually some developing countries like Vietnam or the region of Kerala in India did so much better than countries like the UK, which had to rely on consulting companies, which actually failed quite drastically, even with testing. We need state capacity, and governments need to invest internally in order actually to be outcomes oriented. It means thinking about a portfolio approach. It means not talking about leveling the playing field, but tilting it, not tilting it by choosing one company, one sector, and being captured along the way, but picking big problems and being also quite flexible in that DARPA way, and adaptable, so you also know when to turn the tap off. You don't just keep turning it on. But it especially requires also thinking about public value and public purpose at the heart of political economy, We worked with the UK industrial strategy, for example, to go away from having a random list. And, Mario, it was a random list. It was aeronautics, automobiles, financial services, life sciences, and the creative sector. We said, okay, fine, that's a nice random list of 5 sectors. What if you start focusing on big problems around clean growth, the aging society, future mobility, and the opportunities that data and the data economy provide, say, to the welfare state? Focus on those problems and turn them into missions, like one that we worked on with them around the future of mobility, where just the fact we put 100% accessible public infrastructure, public transport system meant that those bottom-up projects included ones from the disability community. So again, an outcomes-focused industrial strategy which galvanizes that relationship between sectors. That also means that our instruments like public banks could be less handout machines and more, mission-oriented, including creating conditions attached to the loans, the patient loans that a public bank provides, to be transformational. So in Germany, it was quite interesting that the loan that the steel sector received recently was conditional on steel reducing its material content. And they did that through repurpose, reuse, and recycle, not because they went to Davos, but because they had to. Otherwise, they wouldn't get the public loan. And I'm almost finished. COVID-19 is the moment to put into practice all of this, both in terms of how we govern innovation, the intellectual property rights, and the prices of these vaccines and therapies need to reflect collective value creation, but also the conditionalities to these huge, huge bailouts that we're seeing. 2 trillion euros in the European recovery, $2 trillion in the US recovery, and too often it's conditionless. It's just money given away. And I was quite happy that Macron in France was very clear. He said, we're not here to just bail out business. We're here to help transform it. So he produced conditions for both Renault and Air France to lower their material content in order to access the loan. At least in the contract, you don't have to do it today, but you have to commit. Or in Denmark, no recovery funds for companies that use tax havens. And in the US, they also tried in the CARE Act, the Corona Act in the US, to make sure that companies accessing funds wouldn't just use it on share buybacks to boost share prices and stock options, but reinvesting it back into the economy. And this notion, I think, is critical right now. I've just accepted, by the way, today, Dr. Tedros, the DG of WHO, asked me to run a council for WHO, putting health for all at the center of the global economy. This can only happen if we govern the innovation process itself of health and how we think of health systems and well-being at the center of them as how we direct economic growth. And that literally means conditions attached to how we produce, but especially how we govern our health systems. I've finished my time now, so I'll stop, but we need a new vocabulary, a new narrative. Let's stop talking about fixing markets, talk about co-creating. It's not about de-risking, it's welcoming uncertainty and sharing the rewards. It's not leveling, but tilting. It's not picking winners, but picking the willing. And please, let's get better metrics, not cost-benefit analysis, not net present value. We would have never gone to the moon with a cost-benefit analysis. We need to welcome those dynamic spillovers, but we can only do that if we admit that we need to do what Mario was talking about, which is center on the direction of growth and think through what it means for industrial strategy, innovation policy, and the everyday tools like procurement.
Thank you, Professor Mazzucato, for providing excellent insights on the role of governments in strengthening economic resilience. You stressed the need for renewed public-private partnerships in shaping industrial policies for more inclusive and sustainable recovery. Bringing into focus industrial policies serves as a bridge to our next speaker, who is considered as one of the world's leading experts on the analysis of industrial development in developing countries. It is my pleasure to give the floor to Professor Justin F. Lin. Professor Lin is a leading economist with a long career on academic and policy-oriented research. He is professor and honorary dean of the National School of Development, Peking University, and the founding director of the China Center for Economic Research. He served as chief economist and senior vice president at the World Bank between 2008 and 2012, bringing to the forefront the discussion of the impact of climate change and of the global financial crisis on developing countries and how to deal with similar crises. His work includes several publications on Chinese development, new structural economics, and industrialization in developing countries. Professor Lin, we would appreciate listening to your views on what are the new challenges that the pandemic has introduced for developing countries' structural change and future industrial development. The virtual floor is yours.
Well, it's quite a pleasure to join this distinguished panels. And my intervention will be very complimentary to Mario and Mariana. And your points are certainly well taken. And mine will be mainly from the angles of developing countries. And as Mario mentioned, industrial policy is a taboo in many corners of the world, including the global development institutions, and also in developing countries. So in my talk, I'll first discuss why industrial policy is needed. Certainly for Mariana and for Mario, that seems to be natural. But actually, in many corners in the world, industrial policy is still a taboo. And I'd like to address why it's needed. And then secondly, then I'm going to talk about what are the new challenges from COVID-19 for structural change and the future development in developing countries. Then talk about how to use industrial policies to support a fast recovery. We know that the nature of modern economic growth is a process of continuous structural transformation, including the structure of technology and industries, and which increase the labor productivity and income. And also a continuous improvement in a hard infrastructure and an institution to reduce the transaction cost. And from my own study, the new structural economics, I'm convinced to follow the competitive advantages determined by the endowment structure of the country is the best way to develop the industry, because those kind of industry will be consistent with the country's competitive advantages, and it can have lowest the cost of productions. And in a developing country, they have abundant labor supply. And if you develop labor-intensive industries, then you can create more jobs, and those kind of development will be inclusive. And since these sectors are consistent with your competitive advantages, and especially if the government provide adequate hard infrastructure and a financial institution to support investment and so on, then they can be very competitive. Then it will be sustainable. So to achieve inclusive and sustainable, the smart way is to target the industry that the country has competitive advantages. But to follow the competitive advantage in the development process is a term certainly familiar to economists. But how can we help the entrepreneur to follow that kind of principles spontaneously? We need to have a market institutions and use the market institution, and then in the market competition and so on, the relative prices of the factors can reflect the relative scarcity of the endowments in a country. And if you have those kind of price signals for the sake of profit, the entrepreneur will use the technology that can exploit the opportunity of their abundant factors. And they can also go into, they will also go into the sectors which, can use more of their abundant factors. And by that, certainly they follow their competitive advantages in the choice of technology and industries. And so competitive market would be an essential institution. But we are talking about dynamic changes in the structure. We're not talking about the static allocation of resources. And in this dynamic changes, first you need to have entrepreneur to be the first mover. And you need to compensate the first mover for the risk and the cost because they generate externality for the rest of the economy. And the government need to do that. But the success of the first mover also rely on the improvement in the infrastructure like a power supply, port facility, and law networks, as well as the institution, like the financial institution, legal institution, to make the transaction possible and investment feasible. And for those kind of improvement in hard infrastructure or institution, entrepreneur cannot do that. In a developed country, they may be lucky to endow with good institution, good infrastructure. But if we come to the developing country, including Latin America, Africa, South Asia, you find those kind of infrastructure and institutions are not there. If the government will not play a facilitation role, the spontaneous structural transformation cannot occur. And so we need to have a facilitation state. If we want to have a facilitation state, the industrial policy is an helpful, essential vehicle for the facilitation state. The main reason is that the contents of externality compensation will be different for different industry and for country at a different stage of development. And also the content of coordination in the improvement of hard infrastructure or soft institution will also depends on what type of industry we are talking about. And it also related to what stage of development we are talking about. And certainly, if the government has unlimited resources and implementation capacity, we can do everything. However, the real life is that the government resources is limited. The government implementation capacity is also limited. Since the resources and the capacity are limited, you need to use those kind of resources and capacity statistically. So the government will have to pick the right industry and to make that kind of industry to be successful. And also pick winners in a smart way to make that successful would be essential. And that way is to have an industrial policy to identify the right sectors and to understand what are the bottlenecks, constraints for those kind of sectors which are consistent with the country's competitive advantages to become competitive in domestic market and international markets, and to remove those kind of bottlenecks. And industrial policy should play those kind of role. And in a joint hand with the UNIDO, we developed a framework called the growth identification and facilitation for industrial upgrading and diversification to help the development, the country, the government in developing country especially, to identify the right industries, and then also to identify the bottlenecks for those kind of industries which are consistent with your competitive advantages, but they are not competitive yet, and how to identify the bottlenecks and how to remove that. And I recommend people to get access to the UNIDO website to find out that document. Okay. And now we are facing the challenges from COVID-19. I think the challenge of the COVID-19, the first one certainly is pandemic recession. According to IMF, the world economy will contract 4.4%, the largest contraction since the Great Depression. And also the unemployment will be rising in almost every country due to the lockdown, due to the sheltering at home, due to the need to have a social distancing. And according to the World Bank estimate, about 60 million people will be trapped in poverty, newly added number. So certainly that's one of the challenges. And many school children, they could not go to school. They do not have access to online teaching. So they have a loss of education. And that is going to have an extended period of negative effect on their futures. And also, the trade has been hit hard. According to the WTO, the global trade is going to decline from 13% to 32%, and most likely will be more than 20%. And that will also be the largest contraction in the trade since the Great Depression, and especially in commodity exports, tourism, and also remittance from migration workers. And those areas will be severely hit and reduce the revenue, reduce the foreign exchanges, reduce the income for many, many developing countries. And as a result, the government almost everywhere in the world now have a surge in their fiscal deficit. Like in some the advanced countries this year, their fiscal deficits will increase 20% of their GDP. And in a developing country, at least 5% of their GDP. And some developing country, they already have some kind of debt crisis. They cannot pay back their foreign debt and so on, and now in a crisis mode. And so as a result, the governments in most developing countries will have less resources to use the industrial policy to facilitate structural changes in the post-pandemic recovery because of the situation I discussed. Not only so, the international assistance provided by like the multilateral development institutions or bilateral development institution, or even philanthropic, the private, institution are likely to be reduced due to the surge of the government debt, the recession in the developed country, in addition to the rising populism and nationalism in many developed countries before the crisis. I think that that's a reality we are facing in the developing country today. And so by this, what should be the strategies to support a fast recovery? I'm a pragmatic person. We need to have a quick wins. And what will be the quick win? The first one, to helping the existing firms in manufacturing sectors, in service sectors, in agri-processing, and so on, to allow them to come back to the production, to provide jobs and exports and revenues. And as by trade credit, tax exemption, debt restructuring. And also to reinvigorating the existing industrial parks or exploitation zone. And to allow them as a platform for the firm to do the export so they can earn the foreign exchange earning and to avoid the debt crisis and so on, or to mitigate that. And also to retain the existing FDIs in many developing countries, because you see the excess of FDI due to the loss of the revenue, the loss of export market, and so on. The government need to create programs to retain them. That's the first stage in order to have a quick wins. And after the situation is improving, the government may use the industrial policy tool, as I just discussed, growth identification and facilitation for industrial upgrading and diversification, to identify the priority industries and to facilitate the investment of domestic firm or FDI in those industries to achieve dynamic and sustainable industrialization in the country. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Professor Justin Lin, for offering an excellent perspective on the new challenges for structural change and industrial development in developing countries. This concludes the first part of our event today. Thank you to all of our outstanding speakers for their excellent contributions. In the interest of time, we'd like to start immediately with the second part of the event. We now look forward to opening the floor for your questions to our esteemed panel members. First, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Chimori. How can government connect short-term measures that are rapid to COVID-19 with medium and long-term measures that contribute to achieving the transformative growth with equality and sustainability that you highlighted in your presentation?
Thank you very much. Thank you to Mariana. It was really a pleasure. To Justin Lin, thank you very much. What you said, Justin, about the taboo, I agree with you. Many, not only corners, many large extension of the world, there is a taboo. You are putting many times, your presentation is great. Mariana, I think my answer have to do what Mariana said about mission. And for me, that is really important because I think the relation to what is short-term, medium, long-term is many times to put clearly what is the relation with the dreams and reality, you know. Many times it's a difficult process, and you stay living and developing economies, many times you can understand that this is really difficult. The first point, I want to be very clearly, and I agree completely with Mariana, that the state have to have a mission, have to have what type of country we want, what type of willingness we want to put in the arena, what type of industry, production, society. This is important. But mission in industry have to do with research, firms, and sectors. In that sense, mission-oriented processes is one of the most important idea that the state have to do to relate short-term and the long-term, because what you are doing today has an enormous effect when you are going to have an outcome tomorrow. And today in this crisis more than ever. I think this is the first point. I agree with Mariana. It's not a difference, Mariana, but when you go back and you go to the reality, many times you don't feel the capabilities in developing countries. You don't find the industry, you don't have the sector, you don't have the entrepreneurship. And there is the reason we can call sector, we can call whatever we want, but when you go to reality, you have to put your hands in the industry, in the society, in the production, in the technology, and there is an enormous difficulty because you find gaps, you have empty spaces, and really is very complex. You don't have only that. When you come to create a new industry, a new mission, and new processes, many times you have the incumbent industry that don't want to do that. They want to maintain the processes and the control of the state. That is the reason we need to create a mission, but this mission have to be not only the mission of the state, but the mission of the country. That's a really important. There is two, I want to put and to recover two concepts. The first ones, and I want to put clear in this seminar, many times we forget it, and Justin want to he knows better than others the industrial evolution of China. The concept of infant mission that we become to create an infant processes mission, industry, firms, technology. Do remember it's an important concept, because if you don't create those capabilities from the beginning, it's very difficult to create everything. Mission have to be infant, have to be protected a little bit, have to be supported, have to be put in the middle of the state and the relation with the private public. I think you remember the concept of infant industry. I think that the infant mission, infant sectors, firms have to be important. That is important because if you don't create that in developing economies, it's very difficult to create some capabilities. You can import everything because you have external constraints, you understand? And some capabilities have to be created. Some import substitution, how China did, has to be done. That is important. The second word is some import substitution is not bad every time. It's processes. Have to be, countries have developed, Korea and China and catching up countries creating import substitution, and Europe too after the Second World War. That's an important concept, to protect, to create that. The third one is the relation between macro and micro policies. Why macro is important? Because the specificity of developing economy is not the same specificity that have developed one. We are here, we don't have the Central European Bank. We don't have here the Federal Reserve. We have a small bank with enormous asymmetry in power, and we created to maintain, for example, the stability of the exchange rate. Exchange rate is an important variable to create the industry, to create the support capability, support technology. And the relation between macro and micro and industry is an important thing. Don't forget, and I want to recall, and with Mariana, we speak a lot of time in SASEC on this issue. When Chris Freeman created the concept on innovation system, it because Chris Freeman put clearly that Japan developed, putting more important to the industry than the macro policies. Exchange rate was an important variable to develop one. The problem is when we have this economy that are not strong as European or China or America, how we can create the relation between macro and micro where you don't create a Dutch disease, we have a stability of exchange rate. This is a problem that is very difficult to solve it because there is a lot of ideology on that. And I think I want to conclude, mission to create this bridge between short-term, long-term, and the idea of country that we want. We need mission by the state, the development process has to be thinking, have to be putting, as Mariana said, we completely on that. We need some protection, some import substitution, some infant industry mission and firms, some that created those capabilities. And more, we will have some informal sector where people is not unskilled. That's important. A third one is this relation to rethink about macro and micro. This is a crucial one. When you have this enormous crisis, the impact of macro destroy many times the capability that we created in 10 years. You understand that? It's an enormous asymmetry between that. Thank you very much. This is my answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chimori, for your response. We received very interesting questions. Please stay with us. I'd like to go straight to the next question. This one is to Professor Matsukato. As you have stressed in your presentation, the current crisis reinforces existing inequality and has undermined recent progress towards poverty eradication. How can governments tailor industrial policy towards ensuring that those who lost in this crisis are the first one to be part of this rebuilding process?
It's a great question. And I think this really requires not only what I was talking about, going from market fixing to market shaping, but also to look at problems of inequality as just as much a pre-distribution as a redistribution problem. We need to get wealth to be created in the right way in the first place, so we don't create a mess and have to pick up the pieces later. I really encourage people to look at the work of Gabriel Palma on inequality. He shows that so much of what governments are doing today are wasting their energies just having to, work on transfers because they haven't done their own job in making sure that the conditions were right in the first place. And even countries in Scandinavia and say Germany, who have generous welfare states, the welfare state itself isn't able to be as proactive as it should be, which is thinking about the best design and reimagining how we do public education, how we structure public transport, how we organize from the pension systems, to public health, because it's constantly redistributing and picking up the mess. So to focus governments on what they should do, which is that co-creation and co-shaping for inclusive and sustainable growth, we need to get the conditions right in the first place. And that's why I actually talked about conditionalities. So investing in the workforce, investing in training. This is obviously incredibly important, but it shouldn't be seen just as government training programs. Skills are themselves an outcome of business investment. And when businesses are increasingly in many parts of the world extracting a lot of value by not reinvesting profits, and you really see this with the numbers. I'm not going to share my slides again, but trust me, this, $4 trillion, which were used for share buybacks in the last decade, is money that wasn't reinvested. It wasn't reinvested in research and development. It wasn't reinvested in human capital formation. So instead of thinking about, the robots are taking our job, the robots aren't taking our jobs. We program the robots. It's often corporate governance is taking the jobs. Already David Ricardo back in the 1800s was worried about mechanization and jobs. But what then happened from that period to now was that even though mechanization was labor displacing, as long as profits were reinvested, new jobs, new skills appeared. So it's kind of a creative destruction process. When that reinvestment doesn't happen, it's very bad for inequality, it's bad for skill formation, et cetera. So I really think we need to not see this just in terms of industrial strategy, but also corporate governance. And is why I began my presentation with this talk about purpose and stakeholder value. And lastly, the trade unions in the world are talking about the just transition, extremely important concept. The idea is that as we transition towards a greener economy, many sectors, many jobs will be, less useful. They will potentially wither, as they often do when we have transitions. But the trade unions should be at the table, ex ante, not just ex post. They shouldn't be in the position of saying, oh, a transition, let's make sure it's just. They should be labor's voice and other voices, the green movement, the Greta Thunbergs of the world should be at the table ex ante, helping to define the transition itself, not only to react to it after the so-called experts like ourselves have advised governments of how to do it. So this process of co-creation and participation and stakeholder value is not just about public-private, but increasingly for citizens to be part of that process, but also workers. The labor share is at the lowest level it's almost ever been. The profit share is at a very high level. So it's not just about inequality, it's also about the voice. And of course, Hirschman's work on voice was so important. But I think that we should also be part of a movement that opens up our own thinking by also being humble and listening more to other voices, not just professing. And I shouldn't be saying this given how much I talk, but we should shut up and listen more. And we need empathy in governments to learn how to listen.
Thank you, Professor Matsukato, for your elaboration. Again, going straight to the next question, this one is to Professor Lin. What lessons can the Asian experience of recovery from previous crises offer for the recovery strategy of other developing countries today?
Okay, good questions. And I think the recovery from the 2008 crisis will be very different from this one we had. And this one will be much harder. Because in 2008 crisis, the epicenters was in the US, then spread to the European countries. And in the developing country, like China, India, Latin America, and so on, their production are not hit. Their health were not hit. And they did not have huge budget deficit. But this time, the pandemic affected not only the high-income country, but also the developing country. As I mentioned, it's a pandemic recession, almost in every country. And under that kind of situation, the government resources will be much more limited. Last time, luckily China was in a very good position. And with the coordination of G20, every country adopted some kind of fiscal stimulus to make a huge investment, and especially in China. So in the first quarter of 2009, China jumped back to 9% growth and create the growth momentum, not only in China, but also the market demand for commodity exported from Latin America, and also the import of machinery from the European countries, especially Germany and so on. And other emerging market economies were also in that position in the 2008 crisis. But this time, every country was hit. So that's the reason why in my recommendation for the recovery, I first say we need to be pragmatic. We need to support the existing firm to come back to work first before we can talk about supporting the development of new industry or new sectors and so on.
Thank you very much for Justin Lin for sharing your insightful views with us. Now I'd like to turn back to our panel and ask each one of you to provide 1 minute's closing remarks. Maybe we can start with Professor Matsukato.
Oh dear, I was hoping someone else would start so I could think while they were talking. Okay, I'll have to improvise. I mean, I'll just repeat what I said, which is I really think this is the moment to test our ability to implement what we've all been talking about for a long time, which is the developmental state and new industrial strategy. If we can't do it in a moment where there's so much public money going into the system, it's not the time of austerity, right? There's lots of money going into the system. If we don't structure that money, that investment, that liquidity in such a way to do what we didn't do in the financial crisis, where liquidity was put in, but it just ended up back in the financial sector. It didn't land on real economic structures. If we miss that opportunity today, the history books will write about us as having massively failed humanity in the future generations. And we have multiple crises: economic, climate change, and health. And redesigning industrial strategy to be outcomes focused, but bringing public purpose to the center, not just of corporate governance, but public-private partnerships, and designing it into the tools, into the procurement, into the conditionalities for the bailouts, into the way that we think of industrial strategy and innovation policy. These are urgent times that require an urgent redesign.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chimori.
Thank you. I agree completely with what Mariana said. It's not necessary that I make a close. I want only to put on the arena one important thing. It's a question to UNIDO, to all of the United Nations system also. It is possible to develop industrial policy and developing economy without a strong cooperation policy between developed and developing economies. I think that that is not possible. Today, for example, we need a lot of issue about what is intellectual property. We can develop in the region, developing economies in industrial transformation, to have a mission of the state in this crisis, where we need, for example, to open more and more the intellectual property rights, because we have to think that the world is not symmetric. It's very asymmetrical historically, because there is an enormous responsibility what happened in environmental issues, because the development that we had in the development process in more advanced economies clearly is very related with a process of 100 years, 100 and a half. And the condition that we have is that result. And many of developing economies can pay this cost to sustainable economy if we don't have a cooperation process with the North and South, developed and developing economy, where intellectual property, the possibility to open markets for developing economies. It's important. You can say, you develop in the industry, I close the market. No, we can do that. It's impossible. And I think one component in these processes, in this debate, is we have to be very clear that this is not the issue of one country, one developing. The result of this process is the relation between both develop and developing. And we need more multilateral action. We need more cooperation, new cooperation, open market, intellectual property, and enormous debate. Has this seminar, we can be the comparative analysis and the partnership to create a new institution. For example, think at the World Trade Organization. We need to reform that. And yeah, there is an important cooperation for that. Trade, we don't touch the issue of trade, but this is very important. It has to be cooperation, dialogue, and multilateral. Without this ingredient, it's very difficult and complementary world to develop industrially. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Professor Lin?
I think the most important thing for us now is to put pandemic to an end. And if we want to put the pandemic to an end, every country need to contain the COVID-19. Because if some countries still in the epicenters, then because they're contagious, we can see the second wave, the third wave, the fourth wave of this hits. Just like in the 1918 influenza pandemic. And if we want every country to contain it, in the north, in the south, we need to have international corporations. And we need to have a leadership in the international cooperation. And unfortunately, we do not have that today. So there's a danger that this pandemic may lingering to next year, the year after next. But we know the longer the pandemic, the higher the cost, social, health, economy. And so I hope we have the wisdom to come up a way to enhance our cooperation for this crisis. And just like Mariano mentioned, a crisis should not be wasted. We should learn something from that and work together for our future.
Thank you very much. This concludes today's session, which we hope you enjoyed. On behalf of the organizers, I'd like to thank Director General Lyon, Mr. Mario Cimori, Professor Mariana Mazzucato, and Professor Justin Lin for their valuable time and participation. A special thanks goes to the event organizing team at UNIDO. We also thank you, our attendees, for joining the discussion. Last but not least, I'd like to take the opportunity to inform you that the next flagship report of UNIDO, the Industrial Development Report 2022, will also focus on the impact that the pandemic is expected to have in the future of industrialization. The discussion we have in this webinar series will inform the production of the report. We hope you can join in our next session of this series. Until then, stay safe and healthy. Thank you.